What's up everyone, Lance Hedrick here, and today we're going to talk about some variables to help you better dial in your pour-overs at home. Now about a year ago, I put out a recipe that I referred to as my ultimate recipe for pour-overs, and it was kind of a catch-all that would allow you to use whatever grind size, and you can manipulate the pours and the timing in order to optimize your cup. That recipe is the only one still that I have found where you can kind of replicate it roughly and get a good experience. Now the reason I say that is because all these other recipes that you might see are requiring a certain grind size. You're trying to match that grind size of the recommended recipe. But your grinder may produce a lot more fines or a lot less fines, and so the bulk of your dose may be quite a bit different. It's going to cause different drawdowns and overall different cup in the end, so you may not enjoy it even if it's a great recipe for that person's grinder. I still use my ultimate recipe pretty much every day and make minor tweaks to it, but I want to give you some insight into how I make those tweaks based off of a little bit more data. I was looking at the effects of blooming on our extraction. That's one of the main things I tell people to play with in that ultimate recipe. My friends over at Aramse made this video so that I don't have to. So go check that out to kind of understand pouring patterns and the depths and whatnot. We'll go over a couple of them here, but I mainly want to focus on this blooming experiment. I took a medium to lightly roasted washed Peruvian coffee, and I also took a Nordic style lightly roasted Kenya coffee. I brewed them both 3 different times at 3 different bloom times. 30-second bloom time, a minute bloom time, and a 2-minute bloom time. Added no extra agitation. I did 2 pours, 50-gram bloom, then a 200-gram pour. After the 200-gram pour, I didn't swirl or anything. I didn't want to add any agitation that is difficult to reproduce. Measured the extraction, I measured the time, and then I also put it to a blind triangulation. I looked at body, sweetness, balance, bitterness, and acidity. As we increased the bloom time, the extraction also increased. Now to the washed Peru, the differences were much bigger than in the washed Kenya. I could speculate as to why that is, but in reality, I think a lot of it just has to do with different coffees, different densities, different beans, different roasting profiles, different ages off of roast are all going to factor into how it's affected over that time. Maybe if there's more gas, the longer bloom time will have a much bigger effect on the extraction yield and on the taste profile than something with a lot less gas. As I've preached, more extraction does not mean better coffee. I always like to kind of shoot for more efficient extraction, especially in espresso, because I find it usually correlates with better taste. We could do a lower number but implement more efficient structures in order to improve the coffee. It tends to be that in pour-overs we can have a lot more of a stratified extraction while still getting an incredibly interesting, complex, delicious cup of coffee. When I was doing the Peruvian, which was by myself, and I was blindly triangulating it, it was consistently the 30-second bloom that tasted the best. And then the 1-minute bloom, and then by far the worst was the 2-minute bloom. Even though the extraction was much higher, quite a bit higher, it still just was not tasting very good at all. But when I went to the Kenya, and this is where I had Ugo tasting with me, we were pretty calibrated on this, and we consistently thought that the 2-minute bloom was the best. It was very good. It had the most acidity every tasting for the most part. It had really nice balance, really nice sweetness. Now that was shocking to me because I would have assumed that even if a 2-minute bloom tasted better, the acidity should be the highest in the shortest bloom time because you would expect a lower extraction to have a higher perceived acidity. With 30 seconds on either one of these coffees, that wasn't nearly enough time to off-gas the coffee properly. So whenever I poured up, a bulk of those grounds were still floating at the top of the surface, and they clung to the wall because they were kind of sticky. They still had stuff to give, but they stuck there, and we call that high and dry. So as you look at these 2-minute blooms, there was almost no high and dry because we gave it sufficient amount of time to degas. So right when we poured our second pour, the grounds sunk to the bottom and began to do that filtration it's so good at. There's a lot to do with blooming that we're not really taking into account. There are some brews where people are recommending to not bloom at all, which I have my issues with, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But in reality, the bloom is doing a lot of things. It is off-gassing, not degassing, it's off-gassing, which is more spontaneous mechanism. And it is getting the CO2 out of those grounds so that diffusion, the mechanism of extraction, can begin to occur efficiently. The more gas that resides in the coffee, the more difficult it is for extraction to begin. we actually have an image of CO2 bubbles getting kind of trapped in that crust at the top. This is during the blooming. You see the CO2 is trying to get out, but because there's kind of a swelling of the bed, a lot of it gets trapped between that more tightly packed crust that's being formed. Now that crust and the swelling of the bed is not from the particles swelling up. In fact, Dr. Samos Merke has a post about this, which I'll link below. What's happening is the bed is increasing due to those CO2 bubbles releasing out, and they're getting caught kind of into interstitial water. There's also the water that is spreading out the particles. So it's looking like it is a bigger mass of coffee, when in reality, the particles are the same size. They're just expanding due to that CO2 release.
Excavation.
Now, the idea of the bloom is to fully saturate all those grounds, to fully degas them prior to moving on. Based off of your particle size, it might take a little longer for the water to fully enter the grounds in order to degas. Obviously, with smaller particles, they degas almost immediately, or they've already been degassed after you grind it with little tiny fines or microparticles. If you look at that image that we have, immediately you see that there are fine particles lining at the bottom of the brewer. As you're pouring, the fines that want to come out immediately and sink to the bottom, you're mostly agitating those and filling up your filter with that, and you could have a clogged brew. The more water you use, the more separate those fines can get. So if you do a massive bloom, the smaller particles will slowly fall down, and you'll see almost a stratification. On the very bottom, we have really fine sediment, kind of powder-like fines. Then you see small particles above that, then medium particles, and then the ones that are still floating are kind of the boulders. I just kind of stir the bloom, and immediately all of the grounds fall down because I physically allowed the release of the CO2. This is similar in cupping. When you have the crust being formed during that 4 minutes where you're waiting, right when you kind of stir it in order to get that aroma to release, the grounds settle to the bottom. So whenever you have a no bloom pour over, unless you're adding a ton of agitation and prolonging the contact time of the coffee with a lot of stirring, you're going to have that issue where the water is not going to be able to really get into it. It's also an issue I have with osmotic brewing, which may be great for dark roasted coffees because you may not want to extract that very much. You are intentionally brewing really slowly with droplets to not really break that crust, which again is probably helping with the taste of the coffee, so you don't get a lot of the roasty flavors and you don't over extract that coffee to the point where it tastes really badly. Another big thing about the grounds being high up, and if you're not blooming, is that they are not participating in the efficacy of the bed filtration. One of the number one things that we can rely on in pour-overs and in espresso is the efficacy of that bed of coffee to filter out microfines and to make a cleaner cup. The more pours that you do, the more you disturb the bed, the more ejection of these particles can make it through the filter and into your final cup, obfuscating your palate and making the taste a little bit worse. We don't want any of those microparticles getting through. Of course, it's inevitable, it's going to happen, but we want to lessen the amount as much as possible. Also, the more you pour, the more that you're going to clog up the pores of your filter paper, and you're going to cause a longer drawdown, which can allow for more astringency in your final cup. The CO2 can actually be an inhibitor to extraction and cause a lot of channels upward because the gas wants to keep releasing up. So if we don't do a good job blooming with every successive pour, there may be more and more of that CO2 release and causing some channels in your bed, which can cause inconsistency and maybe an improper tasting coffee. Now, when I say channels, I'm not saying that the whole time there's going to be this big grout of water going through these tiny holes that are going to show up as little pinpoints in your bed. That might happen, but in reality, it's just causing an issue, and maybe the water wants to have a higher turbulence through a certain area due to the upward motion of that gas. Every time you pour, the flow rate matters. Every time you pour, the amount that you're flipping the bed and discharging particles and filling the filter with fines is going to change based off of the dynamics of the grounds and how you dosed it into your cup and how they're reacting to the swelling up because of the CO2, because of the age of the coffee, and all of these different variables. So instead of messing with all of that, a very pragmatic and I think sound advice to you would be to lessen the amount of pours and just focus on that bloom time and how you're wetting all of those grounds at the beginning. A lot of people think once the bubbles stop popping, the CO2's all been released, which isn't really the case. Now, in a recent video, I talked about what I called the Samo bloom, which is using colder water to bloom your coffee in order to maintain some of those volatile organic compounds that are likely released whenever you're brewing with really hot water. It's kind of a double-edged sword. You want to have that CO2 all released quickly, and you want to wet all the coffee as quickly and as efficiently as possible. But when you're using colder water, it's harder for the water to enter the grounds and to release that CO2. So you may need to elongate your bloom time in order to get the full effects of that. Otherwise, you may have a lowered extraction and it may not taste as good as with that Kenya. Likely, a colder bloom with the same time parameter may not have been as good if it wasn't efficiently getting inside and degassing the coffee as spontaneously as 95 or 96 degree water could do. Now, this also plays largely into how you should brew a decaf. Through the decaffeination process, it loses a lot of the ability to create carbon dioxide. Now, maybe Dr. Smurke can speak more on this, but what I do notice and know is even with a freshly roasted decaf, you're not getting much of a bloom. And in espresso, you don't get much pressure and you have to go really fine. That's why you notice as the coffee ages, you have to go finer and finer and finer because the carbon dioxide is off-gassing. You don't have as much, so you need to go finer. Decaf coffees, they have a ton of fines, and you probably notice it more in pour-overs than you do in espresso. The bloom is not as important to have a long bloom with because you don't need to get rid of CO2. It's pretty much all gone. You do a short bloom and you can continue your brew. There are different ways that you can pour. I'll show 3 right here though. You have a laminar pour, which tends to not be as effective at agitating the full bed unless you pour incredibly fast, which you would need like a Brewista kettle or something with a wider spout. But pouring with laminar flow kind of gives a pointed agitation and isn't as good as catering down oxygen bubbles to really disrupt and make turbulence in the bottom of the bed. That doesn't make it a bad way to pour, but it's something to kind of understand. So that's what the laminar pour looks like in water. You don't really see anything happening, though there's obviously motion going on. The second would be a turbulent pour. This is pouring just below the breakup point. So a breakup point is when you pour with your kettle and the stream begins to break up. If you go to where the stream, it just about is to break up, but isn't, and so it hits the water and then it kind of breaks up underwater, you're going to introduce a lot of turbulence deep down in the bed. This is incredibly effective to really agitate that coffee and to bring down those bubbles and to really force just a full agitation of that bed. It's the most effective way of doing it. Third way of pouring, which is something else that is from the osmotic flow, is kind of tilt your kettle and let it kind of have the breakup point before it hits the bed. Those water droplets, since they've broken up, they lose a ton of their energy on the impact of water, and they have just very shallow agitation. Now in the water that I'm showing here, it looks like it's going deeper than it actually would if it was coffee there. With coffee, the impact would make it even lower, and it would barely agitate below the surface. It's not a great way to really pour unless you have a darkly roasted coffee and you don't want much agitation and you do want under extraction of some parts of the bed to make it more palatable and more balanced. I would recommend considering whether you want to do a laminar pour or you want to do a turbulent pour and how fast you're wanting to pour it. I make these decisions when I'm doing my brews. So with a decaf coffee, I'm not doing a heavy turbulent flow. I'm probably doing a laminar with a slight circle. I'll put in 18 grams of coffee to 260 grams of water heated at 90 Celsius. I'll do my bloom, and I usually do a bloom a little slower. I don't want the water to go all the way through immediately. I want the bed to absorb as much as possible, use as little water as possible in order to fully saturate that bed and allow that off-gassing so that the diffusion can begin to occur. Then my second pour, maybe after 30 seconds, not going super fast, making sure it's laminar so I'm not introducing a ton of that deep agitation because I don't want all those fines, which there's a lot in decaf, to clog my filter and extend the drawdown. I want my drawdowns in less than 3 minutes, ideally with a decaf. I don't swirl it, I don't touch it, I let it draw down. Other coffees with the same pour setup, I may do a similar bloom. Again, I don't want the water to go through quickly, so I don't blast it so that it'll start bypassing immediately, causing a ton of liquid to go in. And I kind of just stay in the center until it starts to move out, and then I might do one little pass around the edges to ensure full saturation. But around those edges, that's such a small percentage of your bed, you want to focus on the center. Honestly, similar with these that still have high angles. The only difference would be a full flat where it's like a puck, like the next level. If we were to have a cross section of this, the bottom middle would not be moving at all. We'd have a ton of flurry and action up at the top, and we'd likely be shooting a lot of the water through the side and down to the bottom with partial bypass, which is not ideal and can make coffee brews really inconsistent. You can easily test this by doing a bloom, pour around the edge before you hit the coffee, and you'll see clear water essentially make it through, and that's because it's very easy to go around that filter. It's much easier than going through the bed of coffee that has all this CO2 wanting to fight you. With flat bottom brewers, obviously, it's a little different to go all around the edges, though I wouldn't recommend if you're using ruffled filters because that again can promote a lot of that bypass. I suggest doing a coarser grind size and keeping the water column very low. You want that water column low so that there's not as much time for the water to go around and doing multiple pours. The issue is you can have clogging unless you've drilled extra holes in your Kalita, or if you have something like the Sworks where the bottom is pretty open, or the Aurea or something along those lines. Bypass or partial bypass are not necessarily bad. If it was, I would always use a no bypass brewer. I actually prefer V60 brews to most anything, and I think it's because of that stratified extraction. But you need to have it in a way that's more consistent and more predictable so that you aren't, playing with a million variables that are difficult to control. I pour it all in. Yes, it's going to promote more bypass in something like this because the higher up the water level is, the more potential it has of going around. But also, if you pour just one time, that bed settles almost immediately, and all that water is going to go through that bed as evenly as it could, and the bed's going to act as another filter. And you can still get really high extractions. Pay attention to your pour, the speed, and whether it's turbulent or laminar, and how that can affect your extraction. If you're using light coffee, that's harder to extract, or dark coffee, that's easy to extract. Pay attention to if the grounds are settling, or if you have a ton of high and dry, which can really tell you a lot about the amount of carbon dioxide in your coffee. And pay attention to the amount of fines that whatever coffee you're using might produce, like a decaf or a washed Ethiopia. The issue with long drawdowns is there's more chances for channeling, and there's more chances for heterogeneous extraction. There's more chances for astringency. I hope that this video was helpful. If it was confusing, feel free to watch it again. If not, I'll answer some questions down in the comments below. Again, all the data I discuss is in the caption right below. You can go check that out to see about those scores, the sensory scores, as well as the extraction numbers and things like that to kind of verify for yourself what's going on. I would love if you played around with this at home. You'd be surprised what even 30 seconds of a bloom can do to a brew. Maybe try a 5-minute bloom. Play around with whatever you have. Check out my Patreon below if you would like to support the channel, where I do some lives specifically for Patreon. I'll post lives after the fact on a second YouTube account I have. We do a lot of competitions for giveaways of all the equipment that I buy for this channel. And yeah, check that stuff out. Hope you brew something tasty today, and cheers.